I never imagined my life would take such a drastic turn that summer in New York City. At 40, I thought I had everything under control. A stable 15-year marriage to Jack, a successful career as an editor at a prestigious publishing house, and a beautiful home in the suburbs. But everything changed when I received that call from my best friend Rachel. "Sarah, I need your help," Rachel exclaimed on the other end of the line. Her voice sounded excited and anxious at the same time. "Ethan has been accepted to NYU to study architecture. Could you help him get settled in the city?" Ethan, Rachel's son, had always been like a nephew to me. I had watched him grow up, but it had been years since I'd seen him in person. The last time I saw him, he was a gangly, shy teenager. Now, at 18, he was about to start his college life. "Of course," I replied without hesitation. "He can stay with us while he finds a place to live. It'll be a pleasure to help him." Rachel thanked me profusely, and we agreed that Ethan would arrive. The following week, I hung up the phone and headed to the kitchen, where Jack was preparing dinner. "Honey, do you mind if Rachel's son stays with us for a few weeks?" I asked, while tasting the sauce Jack was cooking. "Not at all," he replied with a smile. "It'll be fun to have someone young in the house. It'll make us feel less old." We laughed together and continued with our usual routine. At that moment, I had no idea how that seemingly innocent decision would change the course of our lives. The week flew by between meetings at the publishing house and preparations for Ethan's arrival. I arranged the guest room, bought extra groceries, and even surprised myself by obsessively cleaning every corner of the house. The day Ethan arrived, Jack and I were waiting for him at the airport. As I scanned the crowd of passengers leaving the terminal, my eyes fell on a tall, athletic, young man with messy dark hair and a charming smile. It took me a moment to realize that this handsome young man was Ethan. "Aunt Sarah," he exclaimed. When he saw us, approaching with long, confident strides, I felt a flutter in my stomach when he hugged me. His body was no longer that of the teenager I remembered, but that of a strong young man. I quickly stepped back, disconcerted by my own reaction. "Ethan, how you've grown," I managed to say, trying to maintain my composure. Jack greeted him with a handshake, and we headed to the car. During the drive home, Ethan told us about his study plans, his dreams of becoming a renowned architect, and his excitement about living in the big city. I listened, fascinated, captivated by his enthusiasm and youthful energy. The first few days passed without incident. Ethan quickly adapted to our routine, and his presence brought new vitality to the house. In the mornings, I would see him leave early for his classes, and in the afternoons, I often found him studying in the living room or in the garden. It was on one of those days, while working from home, that I realized something was changing in me. Ethan had returned early from university and was exercising in the backyard. I couldn't help but watch him through the window, observing how drops of sweat ran down his bare torso. I felt a sudden heat in my cheeks and looked away, ashamed of my own thoughts. That night, as Jack and I had dinner, I felt guilty and confused. How could I be having these thoughts about my best friend's son, a boy I had practically watched grow up? "Are you okay, Sarah?" Jack asked, noticing my distraction. "Yes, I'm just tired," I lied, forcing a smile. The following days were a constant struggle between my ethics and my repressed desires. I tried to avoid being alone with Ethan, but at the same time, I longed for his company. Every accidental brush, every furtive glance sent shivers through my body. One afternoon, while showing him some iconic places in the city, we stopped at the observation deck of the Empire State Building. The sun was setting over the city, bathing everything in a golden light. Ethan was standing next to me, our arms almost touching. "Thank you for everything you're doing for me, Aunt Sarah," he said, turning to me with a smile that made my heart race. "It's nothing," I replied, trying to stay calm. "It's a pleasure having you with us." There was a moment of tension-filled silence. Our eyes met, and for an instant, I felt the world stop. Ethan leaned slightly towards me, and I, instead of backing away, found myself moving closer to him. The sound of my phone broke. The spell. It was Jack, asking what time we'd be back for dinner. I answered hastily and suggested we head back home. During the entire ride back, an uncomfortable silence reigned between us. That night, lying next to Jack, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying that moment at the observation deck, imagining what would have happened if the phone hadn't rung. I felt guilty, confused, and worst of all, excited. The following days were torture. Every time Ethan and I crossed paths in the house, the tension was palpable. Our conversations became forced and brief, but our looks said more than 1,000 words. One afternoon, while Jack was on a business trip, I found myself helping Ethan with laundry in the basement. The space was small, and our bodies constantly brushed against each other as we folded clothes. "Sarah," he said suddenly, dropping the ant he had always used. His voice sounded husky and charged with emotion. I turned to him, feeling my heart racing before I could say anything. His lips were on mine in a passionate and desperate kiss. For a moment, I lost myself in the sensation, responding with equal fervor. But then, reality hit me like a bucket of cold water. I abruptly pulled away, gasping, "No, Ethan, this is wrong. We can't." "But you feel it too, don't you?" he asked, his eyes bright with desire and confusion. I couldn't answer. I ran out of the basement, locking myself in my room. I cried for hours, torn between guilt and the burning desire I felt for Ethan. The following days were torment. I tried to avoid Ethan as much as I could, but living under the same roof, it was impossible. Every time we crossed paths, the tension was palpable. I could feel his eyes following me, and I hated myself for wanting him to look at me. Jack noticed something was wrong. "Is everything okay, Sarah?" he asked one night as we had dinner. "You've been very distant lately." "I'm just stressed about work," I lied, feeling even more guilty for deceiving my husband. But the truth was that I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan, about his lips on mine, about how his hands would feel exploring my body. Every night, lying next to Jack, I imagined it was Ethan holding me. A week after the incident in the basement, Jack had to leave town for a conference. He would be gone for 3 days. The idea of being alone with Ethan terrified and excited me in equal parts. The first night, I had dinner alone in my room, avoiding any contact with Ethan. But at midnight, unable to sleep, I went down to the kitchen for a glass of water, and there he was, sitting in the dark, illuminated only by the moonlight coming through the window. "Sarah," he said softly when he saw me, "please, don't avoid me anymore. We need to talk." I sat across from him, my heart beating so hard I feared he might hear it. "Ethan, what happened, it can't happen again. I'm your mother's best friend. I'm married. I'm much older than you." "None of that matters," he interrupted, taking my hand across the table. "What I feel for you is real, and I know you feel the same." I wanted to deny it, but the words got stuck in my throat. Instead, I found myself leaning towards him, our lips meeting in a kiss that made everything else disappear. That night, we crossed a line. There was no going back from. In the darkness of the kitchen, our bodies met in a passionate and forbidden dance. Every caress, every moan, every moment of ecstasy was tinged with equal parts guilt and desire. When dawn came, I found myself in my bed, alone and full of remorse, but also with an excitement I hadn't felt in years. I knew what we were doing was wrong, but I didn't want to stop it. My story isn't over yet. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you. Back to the story. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of unbridled passion. We took advantage of every moment alone to explore our bodies and our deepest desires, on the couch, in the shower, against the kitchen wall. Every corner of the house witnessed our unleashed lust. But with each encounter, the guilt grew inside me. I thought about Jack, about Rachel, about how this could destroy so many lives if discovered, and yet, I couldn't stop myself. When Jack returned, I acted as if nothing had happened. But every time Ethan and I crossed glances. I felt an electric current run through my body. Our affair continued, taking advantage of every moment when Jack wasn't home. There were situations where we were almost caught. One afternoon, while Ethan and I were passionately kissing in the kitchen, we heard the front door open. We quickly separated, and when Jack entered, he found me helping Ethan with a recipe. "What are you cooking?" Jack asked curiously. "Oh, I was just teaching Ethan how to make lasagna," I replied, trying to control the tremor in my voice. Ethan nodded, his cheeks still flushed. "Yes, Sarah is an excellent teacher." The irony of his words didn't escape me, and I had to suppress a nervous laugh. As the weeks passed, our relationship became more intense and dangerous. It was no longer just physical desire. I was starting to develop deep feelings for Ethan, and that terrified me even more than the possibility of being discovered. One night, as we lay together in the guest room bed, Ethan whispered to me, "I love you, Sarah. I want us to leave everything and be together." His words hit me like a punch in the stomach. Love? How could this be love? It was madness, a fantasy that was destined to end in disaster. "Ethan, it can't continue," I said, moving away from him. "We have to stop before someone gets hurt." "Is it because of Jack?" he asked, his voice tinged with jealousy. "Do you love him?" The question left me breathless. Did I love Jack? Of course I did. We had built a life together. But what I felt for Ethan was different, intense, passionate. It was like a fire consuming me. "It's complicated," I finally replied. "Jack is my husband. We've been together for years. And you're my best friend's son. This is wrong on so many levels." Ethan got up from the bed, visibly upset. "So all this has meant nothing to you? Am I just a toy for you, Sarah?" His words hurt me more than I wanted to admit. "No, Ethan. You mean a lot to me, too much, and that's why this has to end." He left the room without saying another word, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my guilt. The following days were torture. Ethan avoided me, and when we crossed paths, his gaze was full of pain and resentment. Jack, oblivious to everything, continued with his normal life, which only increased my feeling of guilt. One night, as the three of us had dinner, together in an uncomfortable silence, Jack announced, "I've been thinking, why don't we go on vacation? The three of us? We could go to the beach, disconnect a bit." Ethan and I looked at each other, surprised. The idea of spending entire days together with Jack present seemed like a recipe for disaster. "I don't know if I can," Ethan said quickly. "I have a lot of projects at the university." "Come on, it'll be fun," Jack insisted. "Besides, Sarah and I haven't had a vacation in years. What do you say, honey?" I felt both their gazes on me. "Sure," I replied, forcing a smile. "Sounds good." That night I couldn't sleep. The idea of the vacation filled me with anxiety. How was I going to handle being close to Ethan all the time, with Jack present? I knew it was an explosive situation waiting to happen. The following week, we found ourselves at a beautiful resort in Florida. The tension between Ethan and me was palpable, but we tried to act normal in front of Jack. We spent our days on the beach, swimming and sunbathing. At night, we dined in elegant restaurants and walked along the beach under the stars. One afternoon, while Jack was taking a nap in the room, Ethan and I found ourselves alone in the hotel pool. The cool water contrasted with the scorching heat of the day, and our bodies brushed against each other under the water. "Sarah," Ethan whispered, dangerously approaching. "I miss you. I can't stand seeing you with him every day." I felt a shiver run through my body. "Ethan, please." "We can't. Jack is here. He could see us at any moment." But my words lacked conviction. My body yearned for his touch, and before I knew it, we were passionately kissing in the pool. The danger of being discovered only increased the excitement. Suddenly, we heard Jack's voice calling us from the terrace of our room. We quickly separated, our hearts racing. "We're here!" I shouted, trying to sound casual. We were just swimming a bit. Jack came down to the pool, oblivious to what he had just interrupted. The rest of the afternoon passed, in unbearable tension, at least for Ethan and me. That night, while Jack slept, I snuck out of the room and met Ethan on the beach. The full moon illuminated the white sand, and the sound of the waves was the only thing breaking the silence of the night. "This has to end, Ethan," I said, with tears in my eyes. "We're hurting too many people, Jack. Your mother, we can't go on like this." Ethan took my hands, his eyes shining intensely. "Then let's leave everything. Let's go away together, start a new life. I love you, Sarah, and I know you love me too." For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine that life, leaving everything behind, starting over with Ethan. But reality quickly set in. "I can't, Ethan," I replied, letting go of his hands. "I have a life, a job, a husband, and you have your whole life ahead of you. I can't take that away from you." "So this is it?" he asked, his voice broken with emotion. "It just ends like this?" I nodded, unable to speak. We hugged one last time, our bodies melting under the moonlight. Then, with a broken heart, I returned to the room where Jack slept peacefully. The rest of the vacation passed in a fog of sadness and regret. Ethan distanced himself, spending most of his time alone, while I tried to act normally with Jack. When we returned to New York City, I felt that something fundamental had changed in me. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions. Ethan moved to a student residence, claiming he wanted to be closer to the university. Jack and I returned to our usual routine, but I felt empty, as if a part of me had gone with Ethan. It was then that I made a decision that would change our lives forever. One night, as Jack and I were having dinner, I gathered all my courage and said, "Jack, we need to talk." The seriousness in my voice made Jack put down his fork and look at me with concern. "What's wrong, Sarah?" With my heart pounding furiously, I told him everything about Ethan, about our affair, about my confused feelings. The words came out like a torrent, and I saw Jack's expression change from confusion to shock and then to anger. "How could you?" he shouted, standing up from the table. "With Rachel's son, a boy who could be your son." His words hit me like slaps, but I knew I deserved them. "I'm sorry, Jack. I have no excuse. I know I've hurt you in the worst possible way." Jack paced around the room, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "Do you love him?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question took me by surprise. Did I love Ethan? Or was I just in love with the idea of him, with the excitement and passion he had brought to my life? "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I know I feel something very strong for him, but I also know that what we did was wrong. And I know I love you, Jack. We've built a life together." Jack looked at me, his eyes full of pain and disappointment. "I need time, Sarah. I can't be here right now." With those words, he took his keys and left the house, leaving me alone with my guilt and remorse. The following days were hell. Jack stayed at his brother's house, refusing to talk to me beyond short, cold messages. Ethan tried to contact me several times, but I didn't answer his calls. I knew I had to face the consequences of my actions. A week after my confession, I made another difficult decision. I bought a bus ticket to Boston. It was time to face Rachel. The journey was long and anguishing. Every mile that brought me closer to Boston increased my anxiety. How was I going to look my best friend in the eye and tell her I had an affair with her son? When I arrived at Rachel's house, she greeted me with a smile that quickly faded when she saw my expression. "Sarah, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." We sat in her living room, and with my heart in my hand, I told her everything I watched as her face went through a range of emotions: confusion, disbelief, pain, and finally a cold anger I had never seen in her before. "Get out of my house," she said when I finished speaking, her voice trembling with contained rage. "I never want to see you again, Sarah. You've betrayed my trust in the worst possible way." I left her house with tears running down my cheeks, knowing I had lost my best friend, forever. The weight of my actions had never been so evident as in that moment. Back in New York City, I found myself alone in our house. Jack had come to pick up some of his things while I was in Boston. He left a note saying he needed more time and space to think. It was in that moment of absolute solitude that I truly faced the consequences of my actions. I had risked everything, my marriage, my friendship, my reputation, for an affair that now seemed so empty and meaningless. Days turned into weeks. I immersed myself in work, trying to fill the void. I felt Jack and I had some tense conversations, mainly about practical matters. It was painfully clear that our marriage had come to an end. One day, I received a message from Ethan. He said he was going to study abroad, that he had gotten a scholarship at a university in Europe. Part of me felt relieved, knowing that the distance would make it easier to overcome what had happened between us. Another part, one I was ashamed to admit, felt sad, knowing I wouldn't see him again. A year passed. My divorce from Jack was finalized. We sold the house, and each went our separate ways. I started going to therapy, trying to understand why I had acted the way I did, looking for ways to forgive myself and rebuild my life. It was then that I received a letter. It was from Ethan. My heart skipped a beat when I saw his handwriting on the envelope, but I forced myself to stay calm as I opened it. In the letter, Ethan told me about his life in Europe, about how he was maturing and growing as a person, and then he got to the part that left me breathless. Sarah, I've thought a lot about what happened between us, and now, with distance and time, I realize that what we felt wasn't true love. It was a fantasy, an escape from our real lives. I was in love with the idea of you, of what you represented. Freedom, passion, something forbidden. But it wasn't real. It wasn't sustainable. I hope you can forgive me for my part in all this, just as I hope you can forgive yourself. I read and reread those words, feeling as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Ethan was right. What we had wasn't love. It was a fantasy, a way to escape from our lives and from ourselves. Now, sitting in my new apartment, I look out the window at the city that never sleeps. I've learned difficult lessons. I've lost a lot along the way. But I've also gained a new perspective on myself and on life. I know the road to redemption will be long and difficult, that rebuilding trust with the people I've hurt will take time, if it ever happens. But I'm determined to live my life with honesty and integrity from now on. The affair with Ethan was a tumultuous chapter in my life, one that changed everything. But it's not the end of my story. It's just the beginning of a new Chapter 1 in which I'm learning to love myself, to be honest with myself and others, and to build relationships based on respect and truth. As the sun sets over New York City, I feel a mix of nostalgia and hope. The future is uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I feel at peace with myself, ready to face whatever comes, with eyes wide open and an honest heart. This is my story, one of love, betrayal, and redemption. A story that has taught me that true love begins with self-love, and that honesty, though sometimes painful, is the only path to true happiness. And so, with a lighter heart and a clearer mind, I prepare for the next chapter of my life, one that I will write carefully, with awareness, and above all, with authenticity.